Welcome, coders. Today we're going to be taking a look at while loops. So let's dive in. All right, so we have a basic index.html setup here and then a main JS, and that's where we'll be writing all of our code. So the while loop, like other loops, loop structures are used to perform some type of an action over and over until you don't want it to be performed anymore. And typically the way we tell it when we want to stop working is through the use of a some type of an expression that will eventually turn false. So let's take a quick look at the syntax. So syntax for a while loop would include the while statement. It would include an expression. For the purposes here, we'll use a nice simple one. We're going to say index is less than 10. All right. And then we would have a code block. All right. So we have a code block, and then the code in here would be performed while index is less than 10. Let's go ahead and create an index variable. So we'll say let index equals 0. And you might be wondering why we're using a let variable to define the index, and that's because the value of index is expected to change. So we'll notice here that while index is less than 10, this code block should run, right? And we're starting index at 0. So if we put a console log in here now, and we'll just say, hello there. We'll go ahead and save that. We will notice if we try to open the file that something interesting will happen. All right. So here's our browser window. I noticed that we did get our text, but we see up here that this is just, it's trying to spin, it's not even spinning. If I click on the page, nothing happens. And this is because we've hit what's called an infinite loop. So an infinite loop is when you start a loop and it doesn't have a condition for ending. So it just runs and runs and runs. So what do I mean by a condition for ending? So if we look at our code, we'll see again, the expression, the conditional expression that we passed to the while statement was index is less than 10. If we look at the value of index here, which is 0, we'll notice that 0, of course, is less than 10, which means that this while loop will never stop running because index will never become equal to or greater than 10, right? It's always going to be 0. So that's called an infinite loop. You will likely write some of those as you're going through your coding adventure. Do not worry. It's pretty typical. When you do have a problem with that, like I did here, you'll notice eventually it'll just say page unresponsive, and then you can click exit page, or you can just close the tab. Not a huge deal. But if you notice that your page is basically frozen and you can't interact with it in any way, it's likely an infinite loop of some kind. It's a very common thing, especially if you're writing loops. It's something to keep an eye out for. All right, so we have this set up, but what we need to do is make sure that the loop doesn't run infinitely. So we have to make sure at some point that this expression here becomes false. Because as long as the expression is true, the loop will run. So at some point it has to become false. And that's really a big cornerstone of working with a loop. All right, so right here below the console statement, we're going to help our expression become false, and we're going to do that by incrementing the value of index. So index plus plus, of course, means take the current value of index, increment it by a number 1, and then reassign the new value back into the index variable. So that's what we're doing here. So what we'll notice then is every time this loop runs, it should increase the value of index, and then at one point index will become either equal to or greater than 10, and then the loop won't run anymore. So our expectation going from 0 to 9, right? Because 9 would be the last value that's less than 10. We should expect 10 console logs. So let's go ahead and open up our index.html. Drag that thing over. There we go. So notice this time, if I right click on it, I can interact with it, which is good because we want to check the inspector so we can see our console. If we go to the console, there's our hello there console logs, and we can see that it happened 10 times. All right, so that's helpful, right? We can see that we created a while loop. We gave it an expression of index less than 10. And then we gave it, took a value that would become at some point, would make this expression false. And that's when index gets up to the value of 10. And then it exits and just continues on doing whatever other code would be there. In this example, we don't have any additional code, but if there was code below here, and we can even demo that, just say while loop is complete. All right, so we have another, and quickly we can go back to our console log, and then there's our 10 hello there's, and then while loop is complete. So once the loop is done, the code just continues to execute. All right, so one thing that we definitely want to check out though, and I know it's because we've said all this and we've looked at it and go, okay, that makes sense, but actually seeing it is usually a big help. So the way that we can do that is by using the inspector. So what we're going to do here is go up to sources, and then there's our main.js file. And we'll notice here we can see the actual JS file that the browser is using. So what we can do here is add something called a breakpoint. So if we add a breakpoint, let's say if we put one on here on line 7, then when the code starts running, and we'll see that when I refresh the page, it will stop running once it hits this breakpoint. And then it'll be highlighted in a green light. So I'm going to go ahead and Command R because I'm on a Mac, Control R if you're on Windows, and that's going to refresh the page. And then notice we have a nice line here that's stopping the code. So the code has stopped. If we look at the console, we should see one console log, right? Because that happened before this line. So there's our hello there console log. All right, now what we want to do is step through this. So if we look over here, we can also see that there's our index variable. It currently has a value of 0. We also notice that if we highlight it, it'll give us a value of 0. So the current value of index is 0. And we'll see that the line of code that we're currently on is index ++. Now, the line of code that you're on has not run yet, which is why when we highlight index, it's still 0. But we can make it run by clicking on this little arrow that's jumping over the circle here. So if we do that, we'll notice now if we highlight index, it has a value of 1 because that line of code has completed. Notice the next line of code that's going to run, and that is the expression here in the while loop, right? So once the work of the loop is done, it goes to the expression and checks it to see if it's still true. We can check that with the inspector by highlighting it. So we can highlight the entire expression. If we highlight it, it says it's true because 1 is less than 10, which is the current value of index. So if we hit forward again, we go back into the work of the loop, and now we're on the console log. And if we look at the console, we still only have the 1, because remember, this line hasn't run yet. If we step forward, the line does run. We check the console, we now have 2 hello there's. If we highlight index, remember this line hasn't run yet, it's still 1. So if we move forward, it increments, we can see that here. And then also, we can highlight it again. See, there's 2 now. If we highlight the full expression, 2 is less than 10. We know that, so we can check it's true. And then we can basically just continue. Console log, increment the value of index, check it again. Console log, increment the value of index, check it again. And we'll keep doing that. Let's do that until we get our index up until 9. But notice how the work just continues. It checks whether or not the expression is true. And if it is, it just continues to do the work. Okay, so now we're up to 9. We can highlight it. 9 is less than 10. So that's still true. So if we go forward, then we'll get to our console, and we should have 9 at this point. Yeah, there's 9. So this is going to be our final one. Now, if we check index, it's currently valued at 9, but this is index ++, which means it's going to change to 10 as soon as we step forward. There we go. So now we have an expression of 10 is less than 10. And notice now it's false. So every other time when it was true, we saw the code inside of the code block run, right? It went to the console log. But now that this expression is false, we can expect that the next line of code to run will not be inside the loop because the loop is done. That expression has become false. So let's go ahead and step forward. All right, and then that takes us out to our console log. So index ends up with a value of 10 at the end. It will maintain that value. And then we're now outside the loop, and the loop is complete. That's a nice little demo of that. All right. So we're going to add another wrinkle to this. What we want to do now is use this while loop in order to populate an array with those same values of 0 to 9, right? Because those were the values that we had inside the index. Once we got to 10, the loop no longer runs, so it's not going to do that anymore. But let's go ahead and create an array and then add values to it. So we can do that outside here. We'll say const numbers array. It's a good name for it. Pull some numbers. We'll set that equal to an empty array. All right, so now we have our array. So inside of our loop, what we want to do is, as it's running, we want to add whatever the current value of index is before we increment it. And we can go ahead and get rid of this hello there console log because we know our loop is running. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to say numbers array. We're going to call the push method, which adds whatever value we give to it to the end of the array that we call the method on, which is an important thing to be aware of, right? Because numbers array, this is a method, the push method on the numbers array. So it's going to add any values we give it to the numbers array. So in this case, we'll keep it simple. We're just going to add index. So whatever the current value of index is. So now we have a numbers array, and then let's go ahead and we'll console log that at the end. So and we'll give it a nice little label, numbers array. So we know what it is, comma, and then our next argument numbers array. Okay, so this should happen once the loop is complete. So let's go ahead and get it forward here. Okay, this is from the previous version, so let's get rid of that. Did I save it? Okay, good. Okay, we refresh, the code runs. If we go to the console log, we'll see that we have our numbers array console log, and if we open it up, we have the numbers 0 through 9. That's pretty cool, right? We're able to add those values. But I think it'll make more sense, actually, if we get to watch as those values are added. So let's go ahead and jump over here to the sources tab. So let's go ahead and put our breakpoint now on line 6. This is when we're doing our push. And if we refresh the page, the code will stop. And now here we are on the numbers array calling the push method. So if we highlight numbers array, it'll tell us what the current value is, which is an array with a length of 0. It does not have any, doesn't have any items in it. If we look at index and highlight it, that is the value of 0. And we can see our numbers array over here on the right-hand side and our value of index. So let's go ahead and step forward to the next line of code. All right, so the push method ran. It pushed the value of 0, and we can see now in our numbers array, there's that value of 0 because it was pushed in. So now we have our index value is being incremented. So we run that, it goes back to, and this is really where the loop comes in, right? Every time the code finishes, it goes back up, it loops up to the top and checks the conditional expression again. If we highlight that, of course, 1 is less than 10, so it's true. So we step forward. That takes us to, again, the push method. This time index is 1. So currently 1 value. We push the next one. Now there's 2 values. So there 1 has been added. Index gets incremented again. The expression gets checked. Current value of index is 2. Is 2 less than 10? It is true, so the code will run. We call the push method on the numbers array and add the number 2. We then increment the value of index again. Index becomes 3. Is 3 less than 10? True. And we just continue to do that. Push the value into the array, increment the index, check it again, push the value into the array, increment again, check the value of index against 10. Notice now it's 5, and we can go ahead and step forward a few times, and that'll get us up to 9. All right, so now the value is 9. Is 9 less than 10? That's still true. So the code will run again. This will be our final push. Let me pull this over so we can see all the values. So currently we have 0 through 8. Push one more time. That's going to add 9. We increment index again. Index is now 10, and we can check it with the highlight. While 10 is less than 10 is essentially what we're looking for here. Oh, there we go. It is false because 10 is not less than 10. So we go to our next line, which means we exit the code block for the while loop. We now get down to the log method of the console object, or the console log is going to log out our numbers array, the string, and then the actual numbers array itself, which if we highlight, we can see what's in there and we can see it here. And then we step forward, and that's the end of the code. There's no more code to run. And also this resume script execution, if you click on that, it'll just run until it either hits another breakpoint or the code is done. And then we can see in the console, there's our numbers array with 0 through 9. Right? So while loops, super useful. Anytime you need to perform an action until some expression turns false, while loops are good for that. Also worth pointing out, while loops, they don't get as much usage, I would say, in JavaScript as maybe some other languages. because JavaScript has the DOM to interact with. So there's other ways of getting input. Typically, while loops are used for something if you have no idea how many times it has to run. So for example, if you went up to like an ATM machine, and it gets you to a menu and it says, please select language. And if you select like an option that doesn't exist, it'll probably say something like incorrect, incorrect input, please try again. And that would be a perfect place for a while loop because it'll just continue to tell you, please try again, unless you choose something that that it's waiting for. So while loops, really good for when you don't know exactly how many times it has to run, can also be used easily for things like this, where we know how many times we want it to run. We want it to run up until index becomes 10, and then we don't want it to run anymore. So that's pretty much it for while loops. Just a quick demo on how they work and some of the syntax involved. Make sure to reach out to your instructor if you have any questions about that. Awesome.